Well, let's see. How are you all? Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, then we're in good shape because I'm going to be the most important thing that you're going to need to listen to today. Along with Reba. Yay. So we're going to share a lot about Paul. You know, there's a lot of things that we're going to share that we know for a fact. There's some things we're going to share that several different people know different things about the same thing. So we're going to give you options about what you want to believe about Paul or whatever we're going to talk about. So it's going to open your mind. It will reconfirm things you already know, and it will maybe give you some new information that you never had before. So we're going to do it in 3 sections. Reba is going to tell us who Paul is and who he was, and then I'm going to tell you about his missionary journeys. So we're all going to take some travels today. You ready to travel? All right, we'll do some traveling. And then the last section is going to be Paul's writings. What did he write and what didn't he write? And what are some of the controversial things in his writings and why do we believe him or not believe? So there can be a lot of challenges. So we will take a couple of breaks so you can get water or go to the bathroom or just hit on each other or whatever you need to do. I had a professor who said the brain can only absorb what the behind can endure. So once this gets uncomfortable, this is not listening anymore. So we have Diva. That's watching on Zoom today in Seattle. So she's available to us. And it's being recorded. So we have about 3 people that couldn't make it today. So they'll have a link where they can get to it. So we might make that available to the rest of you for somebody who couldn't be here, or if you want to watch it again, if you want to review it, maybe on E-News. We'll see. We'll see how it comes out and how pretty I am. I don't do ugly at all. All right. Some of you know Ms. Reba, some of you don't know Reba, but she's been sharing her poetry with us during some of the church services. And so I've asked her to do this part about who is Paul. And so Reba, it's all yours. All right. You're not turned on. Is your mic on? Did you hit a button? Let's get your button on. Let's get your button on. Let's see if it's on. Well, it's orange. Let's see if we can get it red.
Yo-yo.
Yeah. There you go, girl.
Okay, you all. Oh, scared myself.
Getting personal now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So, as Patrick said, today Patrick and I are going to teach you about Apostle Paul. And Apostle Paul was a very controversial figure. As a matter of fact, Patrick will tell you that he is the apostle we love to hate. Okay? So first, I'm going to give you Paul's personal history, who he was, where he was, a bit of his background, and then Patrick's going to tell you what he did, and he did a lot. And hopefully when we're done, you know, all of you guys will have a better understanding of Paul as a man, because he was a man. Sometimes we think of apostles as having wings and just floating around the world. No, he was a man, he was a person just like us. So we're going to learn about Apostle Paul as a man, and then we're going to learn about him as an apostle. Picture of Paul. This is kind of interesting. A paraphrase from an early Christian document, the Acts of Paul, describes Paul as being a bald-headed, bow-legged, short man with a big nose and an unbroken eyebrow that lays like a caterpillar across his forehead. I didn't know that they jived on people in the Bible, but apparently they jive on people in the Bible, okay? Every physical description that I found of Paul, he was unattractive. So at least the scholars agree on that. That's one thing the scholars agree on, is that Paul was unattractive. They don't agree on too much else. Okay, now the word apostle and the word epistle, they're kind of funny words, and sometimes I get apostle and epistle confused. So an apostle is one who is sent out by God to teach the gospel. So an apostle is sent on a mission to teach the gospel, like Paul did. An epistle is a composition in the form of a letter, a long letter. Now, I've been known to write epistles when I text, and I'm working on that. I'm working on that. I'm really working on that, okay? So in this context, epistles refers to the 21 letters or epistles that make up the New Testament. Now, most scholars believe that Paul actually only wrote seven epistles. The epistles that he wrote are Galatians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and 1 Thessalonians. This next slide that Debbie's going to pull up is a picture of Stephen's murder, okay? Before Paul's conversion to Christianity, he was an ardent persecutor of the Christian people. Paul himself said that it was a violent persecution. So in this slide, you see an artist's rendition of the murder of Stephen. So Stephen was murdered because of his Christian faith, and he's considered to be the first Christian martyr. And so Paul was a witness to the stoning of Stephen. So Paul witnessed the persecution of Christians. Paul approved of the persecution of Christians. So who is this man? Who was this man, Paul? He was characterized by the Jews as a dangerous apostate. Now, an apostate is a person who renounces a particular political or religious belief. So Christians have tried to completely separate Paul from Judaism, and Jews have tried to separate him from Christianity. So was Paul a Jew? Was he a Christian? Was he a Jew and a Christian? Is that even possible, to be a Jew and a Christian? We're going to try to suss that out for you today. Okay. Next, you're seeing a picture of the Sanhedrin. Okay. So we're looking at how Paul's story has been skewed. From the time he started spreading the gospel, he's been misunderstood and he's been misrepresented. In Acts 24:5, he's described by a lawyer of the Sanhedrin as a pestilent fellow. So Paul was walking around bugging people about Christ. He bugged people, a pestilent fellow. Okay. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish court of law. They were a religious legislative body that dispersed the law to all of Israel. All the final questions of law were brought before the Sanhedrin. They even were able to declare war. So they were a very powerful legislative body. Now, here's where history gets a little tricky, okay? And history gets tricky all the time, all right? There are two schools of thought on the composition of the Sanhedrin. One theory is they were made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. The other theory is that they were only made up of Pharisees. excuse me, the Pharisees were middle-class men who believed in strict observance to oral and written law. In fact, the Pharisees insisted on the binding strength of oral tradition, and they also believed in resurrection. Now, the Sadducees believed there was no resurrection, no afterlife, no spirit realm, and no angels. So they only accepted written law. That was it, just written law. That's why the Sadducees were sad, you see. I got that from Patrick. Before his conversion to Christianity, Paul was a Pharisee. The next slide you're going to look at is the Well of St. Paul. This is the Well of St. Paul in Turkey. It's claimed to have belonged to Paul when he lived in Tarsus, which is in Turkey. And we can tell by this tribute to his life that he was an extremely influential man. And it's important that we learn about Apostle Paul because he wasn't only influential in shaping the Christian church, but his writings are possibly the only witness we have to Jesus Christ and his Gospels. His epistles are the most influential books of the New Testament after the Gospels. So now as we try to walk by faith in our lives, we can look to the life of Apostle Paul for inspiration. And as we learn about him today, let's keep in mind how we can mirror his devotion in our lives. Okay, map of Tarsus. So let's take a look at Paul's history apart from his journey spreading the gospel. Who was Apostle Paul? Who was he? Well, he was born in Tarsus, Turkey, to a devout Jewish family in 4 BC. Tarsus is located 12 miles from the Mediterranean Sea coast. At that time, it's very important to understand where Paul was, what was influencing Paul, what made him the man he was. So at that time, Tarsus was part of the Roman Empire. So Paul was born into a family of considerable means and status. However, nobody believes that he was aristocratic. And the greatest evidence of Paul being born to a family at the wealthier end of the socioeconomic status was his Roman citizenship, because Roman citizens enjoyed rights and privileges that non-Roman citizens didn't have, okay? They did not enjoy the rights that Roman citizens enjoyed. Actually, the Romans lived on a better diet than non-Roman citizens. So Paul likely lived on a diet of cereals and legumes, usually with sides of meat or sauces made out of fermented fish, vinegar, or honey. The non-Roman citizens ate a porridge called pulse, and pulse was made out of ground wheat and water. So we know that Paul was pretty well nourished. And that's important to know, because it's important to know how he was able to do the things he did. Okay, Rome was one of the foremost cities in the world during Paul's life. It was equal to Alexandria in commercial enterprise, and it rivaled Athens in art and culture. So Paul was influenced by a very culturally rich environment. Now, Paul was raised, I think you saw a picture of the Hellenist statue. Did you just pull up a statue? That's a Hellenistic statue. Paul was raised during the Hellenistic period, and this was a time of prosperity when the Greek culture flourished and expanded, and the city where he grew up was filled with a burgeoning Greek population. So check this out now. Check this out. Paul was raised by a Hebrew family in the home of a Pharisee. He was influenced by Greek culture. He spoke Greek. and Tarsus was in the Roman Empire. So Paul was definitely a man of three worlds: Greek, Roman, and Hebrew. That's very important to know to understand who he was and how he accomplished the things that he did. Now, Paul only alludes to his mother when he speaks of himself as a man set apart from his mother's womb. So now we can only guess. Did Paul's mother grieve her son's choice to follow this new Messiah? Did she do that? Did she become a Christian and join Paul on his spiritual journey? Did she do that? Or did she die during Paul's birth, like Rachel did giving birth to Benjamin? You know, revision of biblical texts have distorted our perception of women in the early Christian movement. So we may never know the answers to what happened to Paul's mother. As for Paul's father, he was a Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin. He may have been a tent maker. Tent maker, Becky, Debbie. Huh? He may have been a tent maker. And the reason we can surmise that he was a tent maker is because sons often follow the profession of their father, and Paul was a tent maker. Now, here's an interesting aside, okay? Nowadays, a pastor who works in a lay profession as well as being a pastor is called a tent maker. So we get that from Paul's history. So if you hear in a church, hey, our pastor is a tent maker, that means he might be a plumber and a pastor. But he's working hard, I'm gonna tell you that. Tent makers work hard. Okay, pull up Roman Empire. So when Paul was born in the first century, the Roman Empire was reeling from a turbulent relationship that they had with a man named King Herod. Now, King Herod was crazy. You should look him up. Look him up. Look up King Herod when you go home. It's interesting. King Herod was appointed by the Roman Empire to rule over Judea. Now, remember, King Herod ordered the killing of all firstborn Jewish males in an attempt to get to Jesus. Okay, so there was a violent backlash against the Christian movement at this time. So we've got to understand that when Paul was spreading the gospel, he was in grave danger. His life was in danger. We've got to understand that. Now, as a child, Paul lived with his parents in a small town called Gishala. It's spelled very interestingly. I hope this writes. This is where Paul was born, in Tarsus, in Turkey, in a small town called Gishala. The town now, in 2014, is a modern town called Jish. It's very interesting. It's very interesting how this history influences our life in the present. You know, that place is there today, and they call it Jish, okay? Paul enjoyed a Mediterranean climate. There were hot, humid summers and damp, chilly winters. It's important to know that the land was fertile and agriculture was abundant. Okay, the development of Tarsus dates back to the Neolithic period, 10,000 BC, around 10,000 BC. So Paul's environment was well established. He came from a very well-established environment. And that, along with his station in life, allowed him to excel at what he did. He wasn't encumbered by the labor of many of his peers. He didn't have to work like his other peers had to do, so he was free to pursue his education. His epistles demonstrate that he had a first-class education. He spoke and wrote Greek fluently. He had a professional mastery of the techniques of rhetoric, so he could argue the law very well. And as well as being influenced by his environment and his family, Paul was educated by the great legal teacher Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a highly respected Pharisee and a doctor of Jewish law. Now, Paul dedicated his life to spreading the gospel of Jesus. He led a ministry, he wrote epistles, he founded churches. It's believed, because we don't really know, but it's believed that Apostle Paul was beheaded by Emperor Nero in Rome. And it was also believed that he was in his 60s. Now check this out. However, in the book of Acts 28, 30 to 31, it ends with Paul alive in Rome. So did Nero behead Paul, or was he alive in Rome? Very interesting. And neither Paul nor any other of the 12 disciples' deaths are recorded in the New Testament. Only Judas. None of the apostles' deaths are recorded in the New Testament. Okay, so let's look at what we know about Paul. We know he was a very controversial figure. We know he was in danger. We know he was a good speaker and he was not poor. We know he only authored 7 of the epistles of the New Testament, and we know he lived in a world where culture, communication, and travel were opening up. They were wide open. We know he went from being a persecutor of Christians to an apostle who spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So how did Paul move from being a critic of Christianity to the most influential apostle next to Jesus Christ? Where did his missionary journey take him? Well, guys, I'm leaving that to Patrick. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
That was exciting.
Yeah.
All right. My microphone working okay? Good, good, good. All right. We are going to take a little bit of a journey here and travel a little bit. I know some of you are good with your geography, and some of you rather suck when it comes to geography. So I'm going to try to be as gentle as possible for all of you to understand what we're doing and where we're going. So Paul, once he gets this revelation from Jesus that on the road to Damascus, he gets this revelation and he gets this vision about I'm wanting you to go do this for me. He believes in all of that. The problem we have is that Jesus, all of Jesus's teachings that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, let us know what Jesus believed and what he was trying to do in leading people into a different way of thinking. And then Paul seems to carry that forward, but tends to make up a lot of stuff as he goes along. Because there were problems in some of the churches that he was starting, his writings tend to be a little more practical in some areas and opinionated in other areas. So we're going to talk about his writings after we get done with the missionary journeys. But he felt this great compulsion to go out and to preach this gospel that he thought he knew and to establish these churches. So he starts on his journeys. Let's go to the timeline shows you exactly how it begins. This would be 37 or so years after Jesus's death, okay? So we're talking 30 years here, and we're talking John's gospel was written after this, after Paul has done all of his journeyings. The book of John then comes in down later after all of this. So we see about 37 AD, he was converted on the road to Damascus. in 37 to 40. He spends 3 years in Arabia. You know, we see, this is interesting that we see a lot of the spiritual leaders spending time away. Jesus went to the wilderness. Remember Jesus? 40 days and 40 nights. Remember what I said in the Gospels? 40 days and 40 nights, not literal 40 days and 40 nights. In Christian talk, 40 days and 40 nights means a long time. Okay. So 3 years could be symbolical. We see other people who spent 3 years here and 3 years there, and so on and so forth. Then 40 to 44 AD, he ministers and preaches in Tarsus and the surrounding regions. He relocates to Antioch in Syria. I'm going to show you all of these things. Then he travels with Barnabas to visit Jerusalem and brings a famine relief offering. In AD 46 or 47 is his first missionary journey. Now we are 46 years beyond where Jesus died. Okay, so try to get those time frames in your mind, because it's a long time. It's a long time, which lasted about 2 years. In AD 50, he attends the Jerusalem Council. We're going to talk about all of that stuff. AD 51, he leaves on his second journey, which would last about 2.5 to 3 years, including 18 months in Corinth. And AD 54, he leaves on his third missionary journey. So now this is 54 years since Jesus has died, okay, including 3 years in Ephesus. In AD 58, he's arrested in Jerusalem, put on trial. In AD 58 through 60, he's held in Caesarea for 2 years. AD 60, he's put back on trial by Festus, the new Roman governor, and eventually transported to Rome. And as Reba said, then more than likely he died, he was beheaded. Who knows what happened to him? He did eventually die, and that just happens because of who we are. So there are 3 journeys that he went to, 3 journeys that he went on, although there are people who believe there were 4 journeys. So the 4th journey, the 3 journeys are all chronicled in the book of Acts. We can just see every stop as he goes. We can see what happened. We're going to talk about all of that real kind of concisely. So the 4th journey is alluded to in some of the other letters, the other epistles. Some of the things that we find might have been a 4th missionary journey were talked about in some of the other letters other than Romans. So it's kind of been pieced together by people over the many centuries as to the fact that he might have gone on this 4th journey and done some missionary work there. I'm not going to cover the 4th journey. Okay, I'm going to cover 3 journeys. I'm going to then cover his journey from Jerusalem to Rome, when he was taken back to Rome, and why that all happened and how we go from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to just look at each map as we have them, because I don't want you to get 4 maps in your lap and get all confused. Some of you might get confused with 1 map. So let's just pass these around. Now, I want you, as your map, to see where we are in the world when we talk about his journeys. You see on the big map here, we've got London and England. We all know where that is in relationship to the United States. Then we've got Spain down here, France and Paris, Stockholm, Sweden, and all of this stuff up here. Russia over to your right. But what we're going to actually be talking about is this area right down in here. Here's Rome. Here's Greece with Athens. All of this, which we called when we were in school Asia Minor, is now Turkey. And then this is the part that's all in the news now. Jerusalem, Israel, Gaza. Okay? Miss Sharon, I'm going to move this for you. That's because I love you. So this part in here is all what we're talking about. Jerusalem, Israel, and Gaza is right here. Syria is right in here. This is what we called Asia Minor when I went to school. This is all Turkey now. So you can see Turkey here. And when it travels, they're going to be going up into this area and down through Greece. which was not called Greece at that time either. So we'll learn all of that. So when he goes from Jerusalem to Rome, he goes around this way, okay? So I wanted you to get an idea. All of our maps are going to cut it down right into this area right here. But I didn't want you to get lost about where we are in the world and to see what his world was. This is all Africa down here and Egypt over here, okay? So I just wanted to give you an overview of what it looks like just for the world so that when we get down to the very first thing you can see. All right, let's go to his first missionary journey. Okay, let's just, yeah, there you go. Let's go to the first missionary journey and see where Paul is going to, because he felt this need to just jump out. Now, before he leaves, he takes John Mark with him. He recruited John Mark to go with him. His mother was named Mary, shock. So this wasn't a Mary that we know, but she was one of the people there in the church in Tarsus. And so he recruited him to go with him. And John Mark eventually is going to abandon him. Barnabas is also on this journey. So we've got John Mark and Paul and Barnabas. We're going to find out later on that there are a lot of people on some of these journeys. It just isn't just Paul jumping a ship and going to the next city. There are people coming along. It becomes a caravan. And so we start out with 3 people. It'd be Saul or Paul. At this point, he's still being called Saul. We'll talk about the change in a little bit. He's still being called Saul, which would have been his Hebrew name. So he's being called Saul at this point. And so we've got Saul and Barnabas, and then we have John Mark going with them also. Eventually, John Mark is going to abandon Barnabas and Saul. And this is going to later lead to a significant dispute between Barnabas and Saul a few years later, because Barnabas and Saul are going to go on over to Cyprus, and they began to preach there. So we're going to see that controversy later. So you see, as they start, in the red, you'll see the first town called Seleucia. You see Seleucia there? Everybody on Seleucia? Okay. So Seleucia is actually the seaport where the harbor is for Antioch. So he would not leave from Antioch. He would come down to Seleucia where he can get a ship. He's not going to be able to get a ship in Antioch. So he starts down in Seleucia and heads down that way. So they are first going to take off from Seleucia, and they're going to go to Cyprus. Now, we went to Cyprus on our last cruise, and it's a beautiful, beautiful Mediterranean island. You see 2 cities there, one on the western coast called Salamis. Salamis is no longer there, it's just ruins. But on the east coast, you'll find Paphos, and Paphos is still there. And I found out it was just 30 miles from where we were when we landed in Limassol. So we have a picture of Cyprus. Show us Cyprus. There. Pretty Mediterranean, beautiful ocean. You can see the water from almost anywhere you go. All right, we're going to go back to the thing now. So anyway, they go over there to Paphos after they get done with Salamis. And in every one of these towns, he goes into the synagogue and he's doing this missionary message. You should know Jesus. You want to be a follower of Jesus. And he's giving this. So they go on over then to Salamis or to Paphos. And now they're beginning to face a great opposition from the earliest opponents. And one of the first opponents is a magician called, I don't think he had a name. He was a Jewish false prophet. And so he was opposing things. So Paul performed a supernatural miracle that blinded the false prophet. And so we see that there is a Roman official here in Paphos that is converted because of this little incident that went on. His name is Sergius Paulus. So now just shortly after they leave these events, Paul's name changes from Saul to Paul. So what happens in this whole instance is that Paul is his Gentile name. Okay, you have Saul as a Jewish name, and you have Paul as a Gentile name. So the Jews and the Gentiles were 2 separate groups of people. The Jews, of course, were the favored people by God, and the Gentiles were everybody who wasn't a Jew. So as he was going in to preach to the Gentiles and be swept up in the things that were going on with the Gentiles, his name then became the Greek name of Paul. And we see then from then on out, most of the time, that we have his name going forward as Paul in a Gentile-focused sort of ministry. So from there, they're going to get on another ship. They're going to go up into Pamphylia. Now, that's the area where you'll find the town Perga. You see the Perga? Okay. So that whole area, the region, the state, is called Pamphylia. So when I talk about Pamphylia, and then they're going to be in Galatia also. So above Pamphylia, you'll see the large thing that says Galatia. So there's another state or another territory there called Galatia. So all of this is just west of Turkey. You see where Ephesus is, and it says Asia. Okay, that's all Turkey over there. So Galatia and Pamphylia and Lycia are all in this western part of the world, just west of Turkey. So I'm just trying to keep you focused on where is he going and what's he doing here. So he goes into Pamphylia and Galatia, and this is where Mark leaves Paul and Barnabas, and he heads back to Jerusalem. So I don't know what the disagreement was about, but he took off. He says, you know, I've had enough of this. And he heads out just as much as he can. So then they go from Perga, where they are, up into Antioch and in Pisidia. Now we have to make the distinction between the two Antiochs. You see where that whole journey ends over on the right to Antioch? Then you see up north, Antioch and Pisidia. So every time there's a distinction in the book of Acts as to which Antioch he's in. All right, so, you know, we have a lot of towns called Paris in the United States. And we have some that's more than one called Phoenix. So you might say Phoenix, Arizona to distinguish. So here we've got Antioch in Pisidian. So they're up in Antioch and Pisidian, and he goes to the synagogue again, and he preaches the good news of Jesus, and he preached there for a number of weeks, and many people were coming to faith in Jesus. This is one of the reasons that he needed to establish churches. They were getting all of these believers coming forward, and in doing this, they became these churches or these groups of people who wanted to study and who wanted to be together and all of this. So then, as usual, Paul is just stirring up crap all the time. So the Jews aren't liking this because they are the favored people of God, and all of a sudden this opposition is coming in, and so Paul is opposed, and the jealousy of the Jews come across, and they contradict what Paul is saying. So they're just constantly stirring up everything that's going on in all these journeys that we see him going on. So Acts 13 says, and when the Gentiles heard this, they were converted. There was a bunch of Gentiles here that were converted. They started rejoicing. They started glorifying the word of God, and as many as were appointed to eternal life believed. So Acts 13 says there were a lot of people who were just coming forward to follow Paul. But although the Gentiles' response to the gospel was positive, we find again the jealousy of the Jews became a significant issue. And as a matter of fact, the Jews eventually drove Paul and Barnabas out of Antioch. Woo! That's a pretty powerful group that can get them to march on out of town and say, you know what, we're kicking you on out of here. So they get kicked out of Antioch and Pisidian. You know, some of us have been kicked out of better places than that, haven't we? Yeah, so now they're going to go on down with the red line to Iconium. Everybody see where Iconium is? Just so you're seeing. All of this part in Galatia, he's going to visit this part several times in several different journeys that he's going on. So he runs down to Iconium. They preach God, and they do Jesus, and they preach miracles down there. Many of the Jews and the Greeks believe in Jesus there. And the unbelieving Jews, guess what they're up to again? Stirring it up and dividing the city. And so Paul and Barnabas go ahead and leave the city when they're told about the attempts to stone them. Now they're ready to stone them. So it was a controversial message that Paul was preaching. It was controversial, and he had already been a Jew, so he knows how the Jews think. So he's probably using all of their good arguments against them. And they're becoming riotous, and they're saying, we're not going to have any of this. The next places he goes is down to Lystra and Derbe. He's going to visit both of these places. And in Lystra, he performs a miracle causing a crippled man to walk. So, I mean, it's not just what he's teaching, it's what he's doing that's controversial. And they're watching him. And so when that occurred, they assumed that Barnabas and Paul were gods. This whole area of the world were just consumed with gods. So when they saw this miracle happen to this crippled man, they said, this must be a god. And so the prophet of Zeus brought animals to offer as sacrifices to Barnabas and Paul. And they said, oh, wait a minute. No. Yeah, we don't want these sacrifices. And they tore their clothes, which means they were very, very, very loud and lamenting the fact that somebody would have thought they were gods when they were preaching that Jesus was God. And so they backed off a lot. So the Jewish believers that had been in Antioch of Pisidian, remember all those troublemakers that ran them out of town, they head on down to Lystra. Let's go down there. We had such fun kicking him out of there. Let's go to Lystra. So they all show up. Here we are, Paul. Guess what? We're going to kick your ass out of here too. They convinced the people of Lystra to stone Paul, and they left him for dead outside of the city. But Paul wasn't dead, and he got up and he walked right back into the middle of the city. Now, can you imagine what the reaction was at that point in time? All right, so we see some persecution going on, and we see Paul persisting. She persists. And so Paul is coming up, and they go on over to Derbe on the next day. And here it says they won a lot of disciples here in Derbe also. So they're really building up these groups of people who want more information about this Jesus and moving on. So they began then to go home from this first missionary journey. And so they decided that they'd first travel back through Galatia, which is all of this upper part, this northern part, and they'll begin to see the blue lines coming back out of Derbe into Lystra. They go back into Iconium. They go back into Antioch and Pisidian. And they come right on back down to Perga, over to Italia, and then they come back over to Antioch. So they traveled about 280 miles in the opposite direction of Antioch in Syria. That's where they started from, or where they land is Antioch in Syria. And so they traveled about 280 miles, and they suffered great persecution in all of Galatia. They wanted to go back through Galatia, even though they had been kicked out of some of those cities. They wanted to go back because they wanted to strengthen these disciples and teach more stuff, doctrine, establish elders in the churches, and pray with the believers. They preached at the nearby port of Italia before they went, and then they sailed to Antioch in Syria. So they returned there, and it says in Acts that they stayed in Antioch in Syria a long time, okay? So we don't know if that was whatever, but in all of this region, they had traveled about 800 miles between 1 and 2 years, and they told everybody there, hey, this has been fabulous. We had a great time. Look at all that we did. So in the midst of all of this, when he gets home, he finds out that there are Jewish people who have become Christians, and they're saying, we need all of these Christians to be obeying the Jewish laws. Paul's saying, being a Christian hasn't anything to do with following Jewish laws. So they said, no, we want them to do this. Then that'll be, do we hear that today in our churches? Oh, if you follow these rules, you're a Christian. If you do these things, then you're a Christian. And if you don't do these things, you're not a Christian. Yeah, we hear it even today. That's what was going on. The Jews were saying, the Jews have become Christian, saying, okay, they're not really Christians unless they do the Jewish things. Then we know that they're Christians. So they have to have this big Jerusalem council. And he heads down to Jerusalem. Do you see where Jerusalem is on your map? Far south. go to Antioch and go south. So they're heading down to Jerusalem for this big council. So he appealed to these apostles in Jerusalem, and he talks to them about what the freedom is in being a Christian. And they also made stops along the way as they went, and Phoenicia and Syria, and then they headed back to Antioch to declare the fact that the Jerusalem council said, no, these people don't have to do the Jewish laws to be Christians. So Paul was very instrumental in that. So Paul and Barnabas get back to Antioch, and they say, let's part ways. We're going to part ways. And they began to plan the second journey, and Barnabas and Saul had intended to go together. However, Acts tells us they had a sharp disagreement. Okay, so not all the time are we able to work with the same person over and over and over again. Had a sharp disagreement, and it was about John Mark. Barnabas said, let's take John Mark with us on our second journey. And Paul said, that boy abandoned us. I'm not up to taking mommy's baby again. So Barnabas said, okay, I'll take John Mark. I'll go with John Mark, and they're going to go over to Cyprus. Remember Cyprus? Yeah, they're going to go over to Cyprus. Barnabas and John Mark are going to Cyprus. And Paul chooses a man named Silas to travel with him by land this time. All right, second journey. And then we're going to take a little break. All right, here's the second journey. Let's get these out. It's important to see the journeys. It's not important that you know exactly where they landed and everything, but it's important to see the journeys because we see the fervor of Paul. We see him having to figure it out and make it up on the fly, and we see him getting a lot of opposition and persecution on all of these trips that he's going on. So on this second journey, that'll make your head spin, won't it? All right, we are in Antioch. Remember where Antioch is? Antioch in Syria. Everybody there? All right, I'm going to show you which one it is right here. Antioch in Syria. All right, on the far right of your map. That's where they're going to start. Yep. So they head northward by land up across to Tarsus. Remember what Tarsus is? Where Paul was born and raised. So he might have wanted to visit family and friends again. All right. So they start out and they go through his hometown of Tarsus. And it says in Acts 15 that they were strengthening believers. So there were believers in Tarsus along the way. And so they go up into that direction. So then he goes right back up into Derbe. Remember Derbe and Lystra and Iconium. Remember all of those? Well, he's going to go back and visit them again. And he was sharing with them, not only encouraging them, but he was telling them what the council in Jerusalem had decided about the Jews, about the Christians having to follow the Jewish rules. So he's bringing that good news to say, no. You don't have to go back to all the old Jewish things. We can move on and we can get this done. So we move on into the areas of Phrygia and Galatia. Galatia is the bigger part on up here. Phrygia is in this area of where Pisidian is and Antioch and so on and so forth. And he continues to preach the gospel in Asia, which is southwest Turkey. So he's preaching all the way through this area. He travels through the region of Mysia, which is also in this part of Galatia and the lower part there of the southwest part of Turkey in there. And he eventually ends up in Troas near the Aegean Sea. So we see that clear over there toward the water now. So we've gone a long ways across here from Antioch and Pisidian, and now he's right over here to Troas. Now we're definitely in the middle of Turkey at this point, which then was called Asia Minor. So the green, all the green is Europe, and all of the white is Asia, what we call Asia today. But this is the country of Turkey in here. And so they've gone on over to Troas this time so that they can take off from there. At this point, Luke joins the journey in Troas. Luke wrote the book of Luke, and we believe that he has written the book of Acts. And there's some conjecture that he wrote the book of Hebrews. I'm not buying it, but you can. But he wrote the book of Luke, and we believe he wrote the book of Acts. So the reason that we think that he joined here is because he's told the story up to this point of Paul and Barnabas and Saul and John Mark in the third person. And all of a sudden, the dialogue changes to first person. I and we. And so we believe that he has joined the journey here. He is a Greek physician and an investigative journalist. And so he would have been a great asset to have along on these journeys and going forward. So while he's in Troas, Paul has a little vision. He has a vision of a man. Look over if you can see where Macedonia is. Over here on your far left. See where Macedonia is? This is that whole section in here. He sees in his vision a man from Macedonia saying, come on over, we need your help. Come over here, we need your help. So this is called the Macedonian vision or the Macedonian call. And preachers will preach about the Macedonian call to go out and win people to Jesus, okay? So this is the Macedonian call that you might or might not hear from. So they go on over there and sail across the Aegean Sea. They go to an island that's right there called Samothrace. And then they go on to Neapolis, which is Greece, okay? This Macedonia, Neapolis sort of place. And the missionary crew then traveled to Philippi. This is the book that's called Philippians, okay? Philippi. So that's where we're going to get Philippi from. And they preached the gospel, and they met a lady here named Lydia. Lydia was a seller of purple. The only people who were able to afford purple garments and purple things were the kings, were the high up people. So she was a very wealthy woman to have had this knowledge, to have access to these materials, to manufacture this stuff. So Lydia was a high up sort of lady, and she began to, she wanted them to come and stay at her house. And we believe she was probably financing some of these missionary journeys. Oh, behind every good man is a better woman. So Lydia is a very important woman in this whole thing. So they're in Philippi now, and they get jailed. They get jailed. The Jews are after them every step they go. They're right on their heels everywhere they go. So they go. They meet this girl who is demon possessed, but yet she's making a lot of money for her employers. And so they throw the demons out of this girl. And now the whole town is upset that this man has lost his income. Woo! So they get jailed. They put him in jail. They're beaten with rods. They're thrown into jail. And then now this is the first time he's officially in prison. Not the last time. It's the first time that he's in prison. And so they begin to pray in prison. They begin to sing hymns to the Lord. They're talking to all of the people that are in there. And all of a sudden, whoo, there is an earthquake. It shakes everything, and the doors fall off of the jail. I'll tell you what, this man walked around blessed, didn't he? Found Lydia, now he gets out of jail free. So he gets his get out of jail free card. All the doors fall off. If the jailer lets these people escape, he will be killed. So he is standing there frightened while all these prisoners are running out of the jail. And Paul stops and talks to him and says, I got some good news for you. And he converted the jailer on the spot. You know, that might have been one of those deathbed confessions. Might have been one of those deathbed conversions. But anyway, so that all happened there. And the jailer took him to the house. He said, come on and meet my family and stay with us and so on and so forth. So he didn't end up getting his life taken from him or anything about that. So after they get out of this jail, all the magistrates in the city hear that they are Roman citizens. Oh my gosh, this is huge. This is huge. They find out they're Roman citizens, and that means that these people who jailed them had no authority over them whatsoever. The Romans should be taking care of them, not the local yokels. So they get all nervous. They get all wiggy about all this. And so the magistrates apologize. So sorry. We had no idea who you were. Mistaken identity. So they go ahead and they say that they were unlawfully imprisoned. And there was kind of a public vindication for Paul and Silas. And everybody seemed to be okay with all of this. So they spent more time there in Philippi, and they spent time with Lydia and made other converts and so on and so forth. Then they're headed down to Thessalonica. Today it's called Thessaloniki in Greece. It's called Thessaloniki. And this is where the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians comes from. It's this town in Thessalonica. So they come down to Thessalonica, and again, he's confronted by the Jews. Exactly. So they caused a great uproar. And so finally, they dragged some of the people that had welcomed Paul, specifically a man named Jason. They pulled him in front of the magistrates, and Jason was eventually released. But Paul and Silas said, "Oh, let's get out of here." You know, so it does seem that the church in Thessalonica continued then to face persecution and trouble from their countrymen after they had gone, but that church continued to grow and to build, and 2 letters were written to them eventually. So then they go on down to Berea. Now, this is one of the most interesting parts because Paul goes to the Jewish synagogue again. So who's going to be in the Jewish synagogue? Jews. Jews. So he goes on down to the Jewish synagogue and he's teaching down there. And he's there. The interesting thing is the Jews are examining the Old Testament to see if what Paul was saying was true. And when they figured out it was, many of them believed in Jesus. So they were called more noble. The Bereans were more noble people because they got down into their Bibles to see if what Paul was saying was right or wrong. So he had a great respect for them. And so I like to think that maybe some of us are more noble because we want to check it out. Is this true? Is this not true? Yeah, am I being taken? Am I being, I can't think of the word. Anyway, so the Jews from Thessalonica heard that that Paul was teaching in Berea. So they headed on down there, and they came to stir up things down in Thessalonica, and there were great crowds going on. The people were here from Thessalonica who were part of the converts, and there were people who were coming down who were part of the Jews. And so this town kind of grew all of a sudden and made everybody really, really nervous. So Paul and Silas left there. And actually, Paul just left there, and he left Saul, and he left a man named Timothy behind. So we see his entourage beginning to get more and more people. So he was escorted 300 miles down to Achaia. This is what we know today as Greece. Achaia, which is where you see Athens and Corinth. So he had 300 people now who are going to escort him down there to the region of Achaia, reaching the city of Athens. Now they're coming into Athens. While Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy to join him in Athens, he became very, very upset because he saw or looked all around the city and all he could see was all of these big idols to other gods. The Parthenon would have been there, and so on and so forth. And so he becomes very, very aggrieved about all of this. And so he's preaching to lots of people all over the place, in the marketplace. And he talks with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And they eventually bring Paul to the Areopagus. So let's have some pictures of the Areopagus. Here is nope, that's Ephesus. We're going to do that one later. I've got those in the wrong place, but we'll come back to them. Come on down to another one. Oops, that's the second one. Here I am. Hello, here I am. This is the Areopagus. This was a place where all the councils met in this part of the region. So the great people would come here to teach, and they would make big decisions. The judges would be here, the councils, the lawgivers, everybody would be here. It's a huge, huge rock. Let's go to the next picture. Yep, you're going. You're going. Yep, go back, go back, go back, go back. There. This huge rock. You can see people up on it. Up to your right is the Parthenon. And we're going to show pictures of that in just a minute. Up to your right is a Parthenon. So you have quite the captive audience, and more than likely people standing on the upper hill could hear whatever was going on down on the lower hill. I mean, it's that close, although that's really far up. But sound would probably have traveled up that way. So whatever was going on was probably, the Parthenon was a great, great worship space for the goddess up there. So this was going on, and Paul is brought to this place. Let's go to the next one. There I am standing. I'm not pretty, but so this is kind of at the base of it, where you go up on top, and let's go to the next one. These are the stairways that were built that probably Paul went up on. You're not allowed to go up on them anymore, and they have safe ones over on the left there. But we wanted to picture this because these were the original stairways where all of these dignitaries would go up on this rock, and where they would have their big teachings and their deciding things and judging and so on and so on and so on. So this was a huge, huge area. Let's go ahead to the next picture. So that's a view from the Areopagus. This was also called Mars Hill. You see, this was built to the god Areo for the Greeks, and the Romans called it Mars, the god Mars. So this is called Mars Hill by the Romans, and Areopagus by the Greek. So then we go ahead to the next picture, and here's the video. Andy took a video for us to show us. See people walking down here? He's up on the top of the hill. So it's kind of got a few little layers that go. This is the modern day city, but this was probably the viewpoint that they could see up on the Areopagus. So they were up above things. They were up here making decisions and making all kinds of decisions about what was going on and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's a huge, huge city. This is all of Athens. Here's people up on Mars Hill, and upcoming up there is the Parthenon. So that's how close. You see how Mars Hill goes at an angle up toward the Parthenon. So you have to get off of the Areopagus and go around a different way to get up on the Parthenon. But I just wanted you to see this place that we actually visited. Now the next picture is the Parthenon. Yeah, here's the Parthenon, and they're always working on it, of course, and lots of things to restore it and so forth. Yeah, and the last picture I think is the Parthenon. So there's the Parthenon, which is up on that hill just opposite Mars Hill. So I wanted you to see that since we'd been there, because it's always nice to see it in person first time. So anyway, we have them going on down to Corinth, and this is his first visit to Corinth. There were a lot of people on Mars Hill that believed him, on Areopagus. There were people who believed him. So we go back to the second missionary journey, and they go down to Corinth. This is his first visit to Corinth. We're still in Greece. This is just the bottom part of Greece down here, or Achaia, as it was known back then. There's just 53 miles between Athens and Corinth. So he goes down there. He's already traveled 1,500 miles. Okay? He's not going by plane either, kids. He stays in Corinth for a year and a half. Stays down there. And so Silas and Timothy join him in Corinth. And here he meets two Jews named Aquila and Priscilla, husband and wife. And they are tent makers. So it's time for Paul to make some money. So he gets with Aquila and Priscilla, and they are tent makers. And that's one of the reasons he spends so much time in Corinth is he's raising money. He's eating again. So he stays with them and works with them while going to the synagogues on the Sabbath to preach. And he's trying to convert the Jews and the Greeks and everybody. Of course, he has some opposition. Is that surprising? From the Jews again. But many people in the city believed, and he did receive vision from God telling him that nobody would harm him. So he stayed a little longer because he felt that way about that he was safe. So the Jews become upset. They eventually tried to bring him before the Roman consul, Gallio, now that we know he's a Roman citizen, who happened to be the older brother of the renowned dramatist and the philosopher Seneca, the tutor of Emperor Nero. And Gallio refused to even hear his case and sent them all away. Nope, not even going to listen to you. See you later. So then he stays there many days longer. He starts his trip back to Antioch in Syria, but he first planned to make a stop in Ephesus, and Priscilla and Aquila come with him. Gee, we haven't had a vacation in a while. Why don't we go to Ephesus with Paul? So they pack up their bags and all their tent making stuff, and they head to Ephesus. We've got a few pictures of Ephesus. I'm going to wrap this up. Yep, it's coming. Maybe he's on this journey. Nope. Go. You know where it is? Oh, yeah, it was back there. Yeah. Ephesus, at the time that Paul was traveling, was a port city. When we went to see Ephesus, it is all ruins. The reason for this is it's no longer on the water. There was a river that came down into where the ocean met the land, where Ephesus was, and it was a great commercial center. And the river came down this way and brought silt and dirt and rocks and filled it all in. Now Ephesus, where the ruins are, is 12 miles from the ocean. So when we went, and it's in Turkey, we went to Kusadasi, which is now the port city. And so once the water dried up, the town dried up. So these are just the ruins, the two pictures that we see of Ephesus. We did not go in there. We did not visit there. We visited on up the hill from there, but we took pictures and we drove by it. Get them quick, Andy. So Ephesus is no longer there, although they can point and say that's where it was. Lots of ruins there, lots of stuff going on. So he takes off. He does his little visit in Ephesus, and it was very brief. And he made plans to leave, but Priscilla and Aquila said, we'll think we'll stay. You know, business is pretty good here. We can make our tents here. So I don't know how long they stay, but they continue to stay there in there. So he goes from Ephesus down all the way down to Caesarea. You see Caesarea down toward Jerusalem. He's headed down to Caesarea, and he briefly visits Jerusalem, and then he travels back up to Antioch in Syria, and it lasted about 2.5 to 3 years. And we're probably down to about 53 to 54 AD. All right, we're going to take a break. Then we'll come back to the third journey and his Rome journey. We've got just a little bit to go. So take a little break, get some water, go to the bathroom, you know, call your spouse, whatever you need to do. Call your girlfriend, call your boyfriend. Learning something? All right. I'm just going to clear up a couple of things that John asked me about because, you have questions. And sometimes you think one thing and you say, well, why isn't that working right? Or why isn't that going right? He had thought that Paul was with Jesus, that he was one of the disciples with Jesus. So he would have been at the Last Supper. He would have been, at the crucifixion and all these things. Paul was not there. He was only called an apostle. You could only be called apostle if you had seen Jesus. So there were only 12 of those, and one died, so then there was another one added. So there were only 13 of those. So Paul was called an apostle because on his way to Damascus to kill Christians, he had a vision. He fell off his donkey. And in this vision, I couldn't say he fell off his ass. You can't say that in church. He fell off his donkey. He got up off his donkey. And he had this vision while he was out. And Jesus said to him, hey, look, you're persecuting my people. I want you to stop doing that. And I want you to go spread my message. So he was blinded. So he goes into town, he meets up with a guy, and the guy says, yeah, this is what you're supposed to do. And he takes the blindness away from him, and Paul gets his act together. Okay, and starts doing this other thing. So he did see Jesus, according to the story. Therefore, they could call him the Apostle Paul. And therefore, that's how that came about. Okay, does that clear up some of that? Yeah. Okay, so here was Jesus down here in Jerusalem. Remember where Jerusalem is? Down at the bottom of our map. Here's Jesus and all his followers down in this area. And Paul is up here in Tarsus, being born, growing up, learning all the stuff. So there's a difference of geography, too, to show you about where he is. All right, let's do the third journey. Sure. 2.5 to 3 years. Yeah. That second journey. Now in seminary, when you took the class on Paul and the book or the book of Acts, you had to be able to write down every stop on every journey on the test. What foolishness is that?
How did you do?
I didn't take either class. I said, what foolishness? Yeah, well, what are you going to do with that, What are you going to do with that when you get up to preach, What are you going to do? All right, we're on the third journey. So after getting back from the second one, they stay in Antioch for some time, maybe just a few weeks, maybe just a few months. And so then they head out, and they're heading out from Antioch. They're going back up into Tarsus, as you see. And they're going back up into Galatia and all of these areas that are north of them as they go back up into this area called Galatia. And he goes back up into the same locations he's been before. So he's trying to encourage these Christians. He's trying to set up the churches and the elders. He's trying to answer questions about what do we believe and what don't we believe and how do we do this, how do we do that, and go on and go on and go on. So he goes up into Tarsus and does all of these churches again up through Lystra and Iconium, Antioch and Pisidian, and then he heads over to Ephesus. And that's why I had Ephesus out of order. My apologies to you. He spends 3 years here in Ephesus. This is a big port city. At that point in time, this was a big port city. So he's going to spend 3 years up in here. And he experiences many afflictions, and he isn't even sure he's going to live through whatever is going on. These could be persecutions. These could be physical illnesses. And this may be the reason he stayed so long, was because something was going on where he thought he might just end up dying here in Ephesus. So there was something going on that was going on. He spent time there in the synagogue. And he went down to a hall of Tyrannus, which was probably a rented hall, or he was invited to teach there. So it was some great building that had where teaching went on all the time. And it says that all, in Acts chapter 19, it says, all the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord. This could be about 2 million people during his 3-year stay in Ephesus, because people would have been coming in and out of this port all day long, 24/7. And they had been staying there for a while, and then maybe they heard about this Paul. Maybe they wanted to go to the synagogue and hear him. Maybe they wanted to go to the hall of Tyrannus and listen to this man preaching and see what was going on, because you know what? All of this area in Asia, which is Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, and all of this up in Galatia, and all this part over here in Greece and Athens and all, they're hearing all this. They don't have telephones, they don't have internet, but they're hearing it. It's going around. And when they are heading to Ephesus to say, you know what? I'm going to take in Paul while I'm there. You know, it was like a good movie. We're going to see what Paul is doing. We're going to bring back word. We're going to tell you how it went, who this man is, and how crazy he is. So he preaches there and teaches in the hall of Tyrannus. And so lots of things go on here. Apollos is doing, there's riots going on, and it finally comes time for him to leave Ephesus, and there's a massive riot. They've been buying their idols. They've been leaving the idols. Demetrius, who's an idol maker, gets all upset. Now he's losing his way of making a living. So all the idol makers are angry at Paul. He's telling them not to have these idols. So the people are throwing their idols away, and the idol makers are going, what? My business has gone down by 90%. So guess what? We got to get rid of Paul. The big riot is on, and they run him out of town, and they try to get him to get them calmed down, but they wouldn't let him, because they knew that Paul was going to get killed. And some of the Christians went into to the crowd and tried to quiet the riot. And right after that, Paul says, "I got to get out of here." So he travels all the way to Macedonia again. So he's gone up through Troas, probably seeing some believers there, and he's going all over to Philippi, over to Macedonia, up in the far left corner. So he's headed over there, and then he's going to go southward into Achaia, which is Greece again. He's going to go down that way. So at some point, Paul receives this correspondence that telling him, your Corinth church is a mess. You better get on down there. So Paul heads out just as fast as he can to get down to Corinth and changes his plan and goes on down. So there's two thoughts here about what happened, and it's not really of any thing, but some think he got to Corinth and he went over to Ephesus. You see the little dotted lines? They thought he took a little trip over to Ephesus to check on things there, and then that he came right back. And others don't believe that it happened at all. So, again, pay your money, take your pick, whatever you want to believe about that, and it just doesn't make any difference. You know, it makes absolutely no difference. So he gets all of this work done in Corinth and stays there for a while, and he says, I got to head back up into Macedonia. So he turns around, and from Corinth, heads back up through Athens, and he goes on, and he sends Titus with a letter to Corinth, which is probably 1 Corinthians, the letter to 1 Corinthians. He sends Titus back because he just, now we don't have this letter. It's called the sorrowful letter. So I don't know what he's all sorrowful about, but we don't have that letter, but he just calls it the sorrowful letter, and he sent that back with Titus. So anyway, the separate correspondence, and well, I don't know what happened. So he goes up to Troas again. He's left Macedonia, stopped in Troas, and he waits Titus to get back from Corinth, who's taken the letter down, the sorrowful letter. And Paul is waiting there in Troas, and he calls it a great open door. So there's obviously a lot of teaching, a lot of people responding, and things are going on. So Paul goes ahead and decides to leave Troas, and he traveled back to find Titus. And he's now in Macedonia. And so he's kind of traveled back and forth there between Troas and Macedonia that he can do there. So he goes back to Macedonia. He's reunited with Titus. the church have in Corinth, he hears they've all repented of whatever they were causing trouble about, and Paul's filled with joy, and things go on. So now there is a little bit of a rebellious factor there in the Corinthians church, and he's trying to get that all settled down, maybe write 2 Corinthians at that point in time, who knows. Then he comes back, he spends 3 months there in Greece, and travels back around in Athens and Greece, or Corinth, back and forth and back and forth. Then he goes to the city of Cenchrea, and I don't even see where that is on your map, but I think it's further south than that. He mentions a deaconess in the church of Cenchrea, and her name is Phoebe. Another woman surfaces. This woman was very important to Paul, and she delivered the letter to the church in Rome. A woman was entrusted to get on a ship and take this letter to the church in Rome. I think we're going to find out that women were important to Paul instead of what the church has taught us over all the years. He called her the patron of many. The patron of many. So, he's going to make one more lap back through Macedonia. His opponents are on his heels, of course. They're always on his heels. He had many companions with him from various churches, which gave him protection while he traveled through Macedonia. He ends up in Philippi again, and he goes over to Troas. In Troas, he's preaching in this upper room. He's preaching like a mother up there. He's preaching, and it's past midnight. Hours and hours and hours. He's preaching. And there's this young guy, and he's sitting in the window, and he falls asleep, and he falls out of the window. Falls down, breaks his neck, dies. His name is Eutychus. Eutychus too. I'm here all week. I'll be here again tomorrow. So Eutychus, Paul runs down the stairs, everybody runs down the stairs. Oh my gosh, have I been preaching that long? I would be a preacher who would say that. Have I been preaching that long, really? They rush down the stairs. They find Eutychus. They raise him from the dead. Woo! What an ending to a sermon. So Troas, it was a fun time said by all. So he's in Troas, and he wants to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. But he wants to see the elders from the church in Ephesus. So he wants to send a letter over to them and said, why don't you meet me in Miletus? Now, can you pinpoint where Ephesus is and where Miletus is? Yeah. Okay, all right. So he said, just come on down there. He said, I'm not going to be able to stop by Ephesus. I know I'm going to just stay too long because I just love you guys too much. I got to get back to Pentecost. I got to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. So he says, come on down to Miletus and meet me in Miletus. And so he spent time with the elders there. He said to them, this is probably the last time you're ever going to see me. They went down to the shore together so he could get on the ship. And they prayed together, and they cried. It says they just wept together, and they went with him out to the ship. So I don't know if they got on boats or if it was shallow enough that they walked out to the boat, but they just did not want to let him go. And why don't you just see this humanness, this humanity of Paul? We see him as this great person, like Reba said, up on a pedestal somewhere. And he really was this person of emotions, and a person who cried, a person who just feared, and a person who just kept on going and going and going. So he meets with them, and he thought he kind of had this premonition that it was just in his cards that he was going to not be able to ever come back here again. And so he goes on. He meets with James and the elders from Ephesus at Miletus. He makes a quick stop at Patara. Probably the ship was stopping there anyway that he was on. So he goes on down to Caesarea. See, he had to go to Tyre because Tyre is the port city. So they had to get off in Tyre. It doesn't say they did anything there because he was headed for Caesarea just as hard as he could go. So some of these people from Asia Minor up here, which we call Turkey today, wanted to stir up trouble for Paul. Well, these people got around. I wonder if they had frequent flyer miles. Maybe some of them did. So this causes a riot in the temple down here in Caesarea, where he is now. And this mob, he's dragged out of the temple by a mob. And the Romans then intervene and they take Paul into custody. All right, so he's imprisoned in Caesarea. He was trying to get to Jerusalem for the Pentecost. Cut short. Mob drags him out of the city. Romans take over. All right, this is our man. We're going to do this. So then Paul addresses the crowd and makes it clear about what Christians are about and what we're trying to do here and so on and so forth. Well, this caused another riot to erupt. So he didn't really gain anything there. It really got worse. The Romans, they take him into their barracks. The Romans were going to flog him, but Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship, which means he needs to go back to Rome for anybody to do anything. So he is taken to the Roman barracks in Caesarea because the town barracks aren't good enough. They take him to the Roman barracks in Caesarea, and he goes before Felix, and he's brought to trial. Ananias, who is a high priest from Jerusalem, just happens to be in Caesarea. So he says, Felix gave Paul the opportunity to speak before the crowd, and Paul shares his truth and tells what it is. Felix was so afraid of Paul's message that he doesn't know what to do with Paul. So he was imprisoned in Caesarea by the Romans for 2 years. So now he's in Caesarea. He's going to hang in there for 2 years, but he was given some freedom, and his friends are allowed to visit him and to take care of his needs. Okay, so there's some freedom in that. He's either put into a house on house arrest, or he's given an open area where he can meet with people. I don't know exactly, but anyway. So then when Festus becomes governor of the region, he says maybe we should do something with Paul. So he brought Paul back to trial. Some of the Jews came from Jerusalem, all right, so they're coming up north from Jerusalem to Caesarea to bring charges against him, and they could not prove any of those charges. So King Herod Agrippa II visits Festus, and Festus asks him, why don't you hear Paul's case? I don't know what to do with this man. So Festus comes in, and King Herod hears the case, and he asks Paul to defend himself. He gives one of his most famous defenses of the gospel, and even encourages King Agrippa to believe in Jesus. And Agrippa famously responds, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul says, well, I just am here because I want everybody to believe. So Festus calls Paul crazy, and both he and Agrippa agree that Paul has really not done anything that might deserve death or imprisonment. Paul could have simply been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar, who's in Rome. Paul had appealed to Caesar and his rights as a Roman citizen, and this then sets into motion the plans for Paul to be transported from Caesarea to Rome, now to face trial in Caesar's court. So there was some good to his appealing and not so good to his appealing. Probably Festus and Agrippa, King Agrippa, would have said, we got nothing against you. Let's let him out and see how he fares. Yeah. And he said, but since you appealed to Caesar, we have to let you go back to Rome. You're going to have to go back to do that and take care of that. This is the journey to Rome, which really isn't much, but I want you to see he gets on a boat again. So now he's going to go to Rome, and they make some stops on the way. You'll see that. But there's a lot of sea travel on this one. He's getting up into his late 50s and early 60s. Yeah. So he's transported from Caesarea to Rome by ship under Roman guard. It was probably tumultuous. It's probably filled with a lot of difficulties. There was a shipwreck that caused him to be deserted on the island of Malta. Do you see where Malta is? Over on your left. Yep. He was shipwrecked there, and he was left for dead. But finally, he wasn't dead. And they finally arrive up in Rome. Everybody see where he was shipwrecked in Malta? Down in the left part of your picture? Yeah, Malta. Yeah, Syracuse. He goes up Syracuse and Rhegium, and then Petula, and then into Rome. So Rome is not a. Rome is also not a port city. So he had to get off in Petula and then go by land up to Rome. Yeah. So you can't get to Rome off the ocean. So he was placed under house arrest for 2 years now, once he arrives in Rome. He has house arrest. He lives in a rented house, and he's able to visit with friends, and he's able to preach the gospel to everybody that shows up. And the book ends there with Paul under house arrest in Rome. So there's some conjecture as to what happened to him next, but we don't know. We don't know. Perhaps he was beheaded by Nero. We don't know what's going to happen. So I wanted to show you that. The fourth missionary journey I'm not going to talk about because I don't know if he did it or he didn't do it. So I don't want to go there. I don't know that. So I want to go to something different now. I want to talk about his writings. And Reba talked about this. We have in the past believed that there were 13 letters. This is what I was taught in seminary. 13 letters that Paul wrote. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and maybe not Hebrews. So these are actually the ones that our scholars are deeming to be authentic. Go back to the first one. 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. So write those down if you want. So we know, and scholars believe, that he wrote these 7. How do they judge this? They judge it by the fact that they look at the way he wrote the ones they know he wrote, and judging the others by saying he uses the same phrases, he uses the same Greek, he writes in the same fashion, he doesn't write in the same fashion, he contradicts himself. Okay, so these are the 7 that are judged as scholars to be authentic. Everybody got those written down? All right, let's go to the next one. These are letters that Paul did not write. This is a new word maybe for you, Deutero-Pauline. That would be the second Paul. So it would be a false Paul. It is a secondary position to the ones that we know Paul wrote, written in his name after his death, some as late as the 2nd century. This was not uncommon in this time and place for people to write under a scholar's name, to act like they were authority. Might be called plagiarism. Might be called plagiarism. Yeah, write those down. All right. So it was these latter writers who insisted that women be subservient to their husbands and that slaves must obey their masters. They've come out of the second writings. It was they who spiritualized Paul's condemnation of the rulers of the world, claiming that these were demonic powers rather than the ruling aristocracies of the Roman Empire. Most scholars view Romans chapter 16, which greets by name more than 24 people, maybe as a fragment of a separate letter. But this chapter is remarkable in documenting the various leadership roles of women in the Christian movement. 10 of Paul's associates here are addressed clearly as women. It's Romans chapter 16. Phoebe, Prisca or Priscilla, Mary, Junia, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, Julia, the mother of Rufus, the sister of Nereus. Contrary to the usual cultural practice, these women are described not in relationship to males, but in terms of their service to the Christian mission. And in some cases, their precise function cannot be determined. For example, some of them are just called workers in the Lord. So we don't know what their position was. Other roles are more defined. He describes Phoebe. The writer uses the Greek word diakonos, deacon. He calls Phoebe a deacon. And later in the book of Timothy, it says, choose from you men who can be deacons. Where did that come from? Interesting, isn't it? So this was applied both to men and women in this passage, and they had men and women deacons. And then prostasis, which is at the time meant a patron or a benefactor or a presider. A woman could have been a presider. Priscilla and her husband Aquila are also mentioned in their dedication to the Gentile mission. We talked about them, how they helped Paul, and they were also tent makers. In Romans chapter 16 and 2 other passages name women before their husband, suggesting that she held a higher status or that she was more highly regarded for her missionary labors. The writer also greets Andronicus and Junia, prominent among the apostles. Until very recently, many of the interpreters translated the feminine Junia as Junius, making it a man's name, certain that no woman could ever be called an apostle. However, there is no written evidence in the ancient writings for a person named Junius as a masculine name, whereas numerous women in ancient documents are called Junia. Yay! Modern scholars have challenged the authenticity of these letters chiefly for the following reasons. The letters show differences in style, the vocabulary, and the theology from the undisputed Pauline letters, and they address issues and situations that do not correspond to those of Paul's lifetime, but seem to reflect a later period. Some scholars have seen in the Deutero-Pauline letters, especially in Colossians and Ephesians, evidence for a Pauline school, perhaps centered in Ephesus, that preserved, developed, and applied the Pauline teachings. So they might have said, this is something Paul should have said, and he didn't say it. Following the practice of their early day, early Christians sometimes composed documents in the name of a highly regarded authority, drawing on knowledge of that person's thought and perspectives, and most scholars regard these letters as originating from Paul himself. Paul was indeed a mystic. He talks about being brought up into the seventh heaven. There were 7 layers of heaven for the Jews. One started under the earth, and then the earth that we stand on, and then the air right in here where we breathe, and then where the rain and the snow come from, and then the clouds, and then the blue where the stars are, and then the very presence of God. So when he was brought up into the 7th heaven, he saw God. This is a mystic experience. We see Christian mystics through all the 16th, 17th, 18th, 1900s who come into the presence of God, have a new truth or a new revelation to share with the world. So he was truly a mystic. Sometimes his writings reflect that rather than just facts and figures. It reflects this mysticism that goes off into the spiritual stuff that he's trying to explain and is very, very hard to explain. Early Jewish mysticism was not a peaceful yogic activity, but it was one who experienced an ascent through the heavens until he reached God's throne, bringing back terrifying news about God's imminent judgment of all humankind. So that's kind of where he was about that. So we find the conflict with Paul's writings coming in not what did Paul write, but what did others write who wanted us to believe they were Paul. Is there value in these Deutero-Pauline letters? There is some value there. There's some value to pick out. The thing that we have to watch out for is that we are now beginning to, the church has been known for years and centuries to equate Paul's writing with Jesus' teachings. And if you sit down and you look at all that Paul wrote and you see that all that Jesus taught, there's not a lot in common. There's not a lot in common between the two. And so what we've done is, what the church has done is, they've made Jesus this important, and they made Paul this important, and at times, Paul this important. So we need to quit making Paul the God of who we are. Paul has some interesting things to say. Paul has some direction to give to churches that makes sense because he was doing it. He was setting them up, and he was taking care of arguments and all kinds of things that were going on. So he had that going on, and so sometimes what he says about church politics and church wranglings and church disagreements is some really, really great things. But he also does what John does in the book of John. We see, remember, all of you who took my Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke showing the biography of Jesus. And John comes along in the 90s, AD 90, and he starts telling all of this other stuff about Jesus. Jesus never called himself the Son of God over here in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And all of a sudden, John's saying, I am the Son of God. I am that I am. I am, blah, blah, blah. So what we're finding is that John is trying to codify a theology for the early church. So he's saying we have to believe this about John. I like to think of John's writing is talking about me. I am the light. I am the bread. I am the water of life. I am. So when I see the I ams, I have to look into John and say, what does this say about me? It doesn't change who Jesus was, but it certainly can change who I am. So John's important, but not for the reasons we always thought. Paul is important, but not for all of the reasons we always thought, because Paul now is constructing his own theology based upon all the Jewish writings that he wants now to apply to Jesus. And so he brings those writings forward, and he says, look, we had all of this before. We had priests, and we had the sacrificing of animals, and we had all of this stuff going on, and I want you to see Jesus in this. Really? Jesus never said that's who he was, but Paul says this is who he is. And so we see all of this beginning to happen about needing Jesus to save us from our sins, being our superhero. So Paul is the first one to paint pictures of a superhero, one who came down out of the heavens, one who came with a cape on his back and said, I will rescue you. I'm always here for you. I am the greatest that could ever be. And Jesus never said that. He preached in humility. He preached in love. He preached in kindness. He healed the sick. He took care of people one-on-one. So I want you to see Paul in a whole new light. Paul doesn't hold any power over us. He may have some things that we want to learn that are important to us and to our going forward, but Paul is not the person that we want to look at and say, Paul's going to tell us exactly how to live our life, I'm going to go back to Jesus. I'm going to go back to Jesus. We have to remember who set up the New Testament also. It was a council of men. Really? They decided which books were going to go in and which books were not going to go in. So they wanted Paul in because, you know what? That was the theology they wanted to purport. So women got a bad rap. When they put the Bible into English out of Paul's writings, homosexuals got a bad rap. And that was all about English translation. So that came later down the line, much later. So anyway, if you can trace back to the spot, you can make some decisions. And so I want to get you some freedom about Paul. Paul wasn't a bad guy, but Paul was just a man. He had opinions. Sometimes when you read his writings, you have to be smart enough to say, what is cultural and what is truth? He wrote a lot about his culture. But so did the Deutero-Pauline letters. Wrote a bunch about culture because they feared that as we go into the Gentile world, the Greek world, out of the Jewish world, that having these women having equal power with everybody else, they're not going to accept that because that's not acceptable in their cultures. So they needed letters to come along to say, if we're going to further this thing and make it a worldwide religion, we need to be a little more culturally adept and move forward. Questions, comments? Get the heck out of here. Thank you, Reba. A huge thank you to Debbie for taking care of the slides, putting them up for us, doing it as late as yesterday. Sometimes we just can't get our act together or we just can't decide everything we want. And for Adam, who made this all work. So those who were on Zoom, or if you see the recording of it, the slides came up for them just like they did for you. So, I mean, he coordinated all of that, and that to me is just a miracle. Diva, we love you. Thanks for being here. Take everything you learned and tell those Seattleites. All right, thank you guys so much.